Good evening and welcome to Strictly Speaking. My name is Joshua Reaves. I'm the Director of University Theater here at NC State. And tonight we have a guest calling all the way from Maine. Emily Tadlock is here. She is a broadcast journalist. She is a communications director, has been in theater. Emily, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. Now, to get started, Emily, we're going to ask you the same question we ask every guest, but I'm going to preface that first. Emily, you don't necessarily work in theater, but you have worked in many fields that does exactly the same kind of thing. We do tell stories. Emily, I'd love to hit all those various things that you have done. Let's begin with your current role as communications director. So, Emily, in your own words, what does it mean to be a communications director?
So as a communications director, I'm still telling stories. I'm just telling the story of one company. So I actually currently work as a communications director for Sargent, which is a construction company of about 450 employees in Maine. It is an employee stock ownership program type company. So it's employee owned. Which is very unique. There's not a ton of those in New England. And so I get to tell the stories why Sargent is so special. And it really is a very special company. So I'm still doing a lot of the things that I did before, just a little bit differently. So I still run a podcast for our company, which is very unique. I've only been with Sargent for about 3 months now, but they started it back when the pandemic happened, when the pandemic first hit. As a way to communicate. And since I took over, the podcast is now external. So we also reach outside clients and others who want to listen into what we're doing at our company. So it's kind of neat and fun and different. And I do a lot of event planning, recruiting, those sorts of things. It's a challenge, something new, and I'm excited about it.
So what does a podcast for a construction company, what do you talk about? What are the topics on your podcast?
Oh my gosh, there's so many different things to talk about. So we do so many different jobs. Whether we are working on an airport taxiway or we're working on a new pipeline system, sewer in the town. It's not the most fun thing to be talking about, but it's a set we need. And it's something that our company provides. We also work heavily on landfills and making them environmentally safe and secure. There's lots of different things that we do, and there's lots of different people that we work with. And so there's really a ton of stories. Sargent is a company that's been around for almost 100 years now, and we have us for over 50.
Okay.
Everyone has a unique story.
So now tell me, you've been there for 3 months now. Take us through a day-to-day operations for you. What do you do as a communications director?
So it's funny. One of the things I love about this is it's very similar to when I was working as a journalist. Is day-to-day is different all the time because we're constantly doing new projects. So I go out in the field. I put on steel toe boots and eye protection, and I go out into the fields and I get pictures and I get video and I talk to the men and women about what they're working on, what they're doing, what they're passionate about, because these people are very passionate about what they do. You have to be, especially working in construction in Maine, when sometimes it's -20 out and you're still out frozen hard dirt. So it's not always the most delightful job, but these people love what they do. So again, I'm out in the field. Sometimes I'm in our podcast studio, which is really just a room with our podcast system set up. And so every day is a little bit different.
Okay. And so you started in January, and you had just left your job at WABI, TV5, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I was an anchor in MMJ there for 4 years.
Awesome. So, and I will preface that, we invited you onto the show because we wanted to talk to you about that anchor job. So this is not anything against Sargent or your current position, but really interested in hearing about how a broadcast journalist and anchor, how that all works. So can you tell us what it means to be an anchor, what it means to be a broadcast journalist?
It's one of the things I loved about theater is being part of a story. And so in journalism, you're doing that exact same thing. Now, journalists get a really bad rap, especially lately. There's a lot of contentious subjects out there, but there are a lot, especially where I was at in a very small town in rural. There's a lot of community stories and heartfelt stories that people need to hear, especially in a trying time like we're in right now. So really finding those and giving people a voice that may not necessarily have one otherwise, that is what a journalist is. That is what a journalist does. Telling those stories and bringing masses and light information or a new perspective or a new viewpoint that they may not have for because they've never been in those shoes. Being a journalist is really just being a storyteller in a
Okay.
unique way.
Well,
And
and
there's some sort of performance to it too, you know?
of course. And can you kind of take us through that unique way? Like, most of our viewers tonight, and even what I've worked with you in the theater, it's about performing to a live audience. Can you talk to us about what it's like to be behind the camera? What's a day to day thing? What do you do? When you walk in the morning through the end of the shoot.
Yeah, so it's funny. So one of the things, when you hear me say anchor, a lot of times you think that I just sit at a desk in front of a camera and I read the teleprompter. That's not what I did. So I was also an MMJ. So I would report during the day and then I would anchor at night. So I'd come in whether I had fixed up a story for myself, I made a lot of contacts living here and working here. So sometimes I had story ideas that I wanted to work on originally and I'd set them up for myself. Or sometimes there was breaking news and I'd immediately be sent out to that instead. So I had to be ready to go no matter what. I had a go bag in my car. I learned that after the first time that I went out to a story and I was wearing heels and a dress and it was like 15 degrees outside. I learned very quickly that that was a bad idea and I needed to have a go bag just in case. And it came in handy quite often. But so really when I would get in, I would go to whatever story I either had set up or breaking news, and I carried my own camera equipment, my own lighting, my own everything. I had a car to myself. I'd hop in, grab my equipment, and I'd go. And then I would shoot everything myself with my camera. Yeah, it's really, you get a chance to be super creative in your own way, and you start to tell stories your own way too. There's like certain people that you'll notice as if you watch news quite often that have certain ways of doing things, and that's kind of their unique signature. Mine was always heartfelt stories. If I always this is terrible, but this is journalist talk, but if I can make someone cry even if it was happy tears, then I'd done a really good job. And it's terrible to say that because sometimes they're not happy tears and it is crying because of a sad reason. But at the same time, I'm really conveying those feelings and how people feel about something. And that resonates with people.
Yeah, and I think it's I think a better way to, well, not a better way, but I think
Yeah.
another way of putting it would be you've touched people, and I think that's what we do and you do, and that's great to hear. Can you tell us what an MMJ stands for?
Right. Multimedia journalist. Basically, they used to call us one man band.
Hmm.
Is what we were called originally. And then they were like, we should probably switch that up a little bit, especially with things going online, having bloggers, having your website. I posted all of my own stories to our website. I wrote all of my own stories. I voiced all my own stories. I edited all my own stories.
Oh, wow.
So basically, you just have to be able to do everything. And
Hmm.
so a lot of companies, that's what they're doing now is hiring MMJs. They want you in front of the camera and they want you to be able to do everything behind it too.
Gotcha. And how is the, vetting process, or is there an approval process? Once you've gone out into the field, you've shot everything, you've recorded it, you've written it, and you pass it off, I assume. Is there a vetting or an approval process, or does it just go straight to the air?
Right. So most of the time, you have an executive producer who will read over your work. It depends on what market you're in. I worked in Boston as a writer, actually. And while I was working there as a writer, there was a huge chain of command
Hmm.
because we're in a much larger market. Where I was at in Bangor, it was normally just one person who would read my stuff. And sometimes it didn't even get read because we were on such a quick deadline. But that's the whole point. You have to be trustworthy. That's a huge part
Yeah.
of being a journalist, is being trustworthy and telling the story and presenting both sides of a story. Um, and so there, there is a good amount of trust that goes into the work that you do. And you'll be called out if you've said something or edited something that was incorrect. So yeah, yeah. It's be called out real quick. I
Oh,
didn't have too
wow.
many of those issues, but you will be.
Wow. Okay. Well, Amelia, we got our another question tonight. Amelia says, "Hi, Emily. My name is Amelia Mendez, and I'm a communications major with a minor in theater. The reason I picked my major was because it's so versatile. It really sounds like you found your niche. How would you recommend starting to find your fit after graduation?"
Oh gosh, it's so hard. I mean, really, because there are so many things that we can do, especially with a communications degree and theater. So funny you say that. When I was an undergraduate and Joshua Reaves was my professor, I was a theater major and I had a minor in communications, ended up making that a second major and graduating with both. But I remember when I started with all of my theater classes first. Later on in my undergraduate careers, when I started focusing on communications, but I realized very quickly that so many things cross over, so many things, whether it's lighting, the way you set up a camera angle, all of those things. I mean, I remember sitting in the theater for hours doing lighting designs with you. And so all of that came back into play when I was setting up a story and setting up my lighting and how this would look, because there are moods that are conveyed. Same thing with music. There are different pieces of music that could lay underneath the story that can convey different emotion. And so that's all of that goes into each other. So really, I think try it.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to try it. I honestly, I think that's the biggest advice I can give you is if you see something that you think you could do, that you're just try it. Don't be afraid to try it. Being a community director is, I mean, it was scary for me at first because I hadn't done anything like this in a while. My focus had been journalism. I mean, I went to graduate school for journalism. And so I was so focused on that for such a long time. This opportunity presented itself, and I was nervous because there's a lot of stuff that goes into it. I do a lot of marketing as well. And I took some business classes in undergrad too, but that's years ago. So, I had to relearn some things, but it's a challenge, but it was a fun challenge. And I'm learning new stuff every day. I mean, I work in a construction industry, which I don't really know much about. So I can tell you what an excavator is now.
Hey, awesome.
There you go.
Well, Amelia, thank you so much for that question. And everyone, remember, the Q&A is open for you to ask Emily anything you'd like to ask. So make sure you throw those questions out there. So, Emily, you were at WABI and the pandemic hit back in March. I'd love to hear about, did that change or shift the way y'all worked or the way you approached the work?
Oh my gosh, so much. I mean, it affected our industry like you wouldn't believe. Um, Before it was go, 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 have to be there, have to be there, have to be there. And it turned into, I can do a live broadcast from my living room. What? And that's what it became. I mean, I would do live hour-long shows from my office in my house with my kids right next to me, off camera. That's how it started to look. Just being careful all the time, constantly making sure you wear your mask. All of our cars had hand sanitizer. We shared cars a lot, so we had to completely and totally scrub things down. Microphones. I used to be the first person to shove a microphone in someone's face and be like, give me the story. And handheld mic to this long pole, which actually I loved, by the way. A long pole that I'd have to use to reach. But a lot of times, unfortunately, journalism is still kind of a male dominated field in a lot of ways. So sometimes when you get up to a scene, there's all these bigger camera guys in the way. And so you have to find a way to shove your way in there. Well, with the stick, I could just get right in there. I never had to worry about it. So I ended up loving that part. But there were lots of things that changed our industry completely. constant briefings.
Oh.
We did briefings all the time, of course, but not daily and not constantly about people's health and about people dying. And the shift was rough sometimes. I mean, telling those stories day after day. I mean, I can't tell you for months, all I was on was COVID. That's all I covered for such a long time. And then we started to realize that this wasn't going away. It was starting to have mental health impacts. And so our management really took a step back and said, okay, look, if you have someone who's covered COVID stories for an entire week, we need to make sure we shift them to something else the next week. Because it really does take a toll on your mental health, covering that constantly.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, we have another question here from Rich Holly. And I was just about to ask you about your North Carolina, being from a North Carolina native. Rich asks, you're from NC, working as an anchor in Maine. Did you have to work with a dialect coach? And did you study specific speech patterns to develop that anchor approach to delivering the stories on air?
So it's so funny you ask that. I don't know this is very informal as Professor Reaves. I still call you Professor Reaves. It's so weird.
Yeah.
As he pointed out before, but it's informal. So I feel like I've let my guard down a little bit. I'm not as focused on my pronunciation. So that twang is still there. I can tell you right now that where I'm at, it was actually a unique marker about me that people liked. So I kept it to an extent, but you can tell a huge difference from when I'm talking to someone in general, just, in conversation versus my anchor voice. And I never worked with a dialect coach. It was more, I just started to notice things. My O's were very, very obvious. So when I would say home, instead of saying home, I would say home. And things like that. And so I started to recognize those things. And some of it really, I don't know if it was as much recognition as it was, little teasing here and there from like colleagues or friends or whatever, that, I mean, I still say no, I do it. Those little things, teasing just making it obvious to me is what eventually made me pay attention to it. And again, if I had decided to keep going with journalism and move to another market, who knows? I may have eventually needed to work with someone, but again, I had kind of gotten it pretty neutral for the most part, except for, just a little bit here and there that was a unique marker about myself. And I didn't necessarily want to get rid of that completely either, which I was told was totally okay.
Well, that's great. I mean, people should be able to be who they are. So that's great.
Exactly.
And Rich, thank you for that question. My question to you about being a North Carolina native and moving up to Boston and then on to into Maine. For our students who may be native to North Carolina and not really moved out of the state, what was it like moving to a new state, especially a new climate, after spending your whole life here in North Carolina?
Yeah, so born and raised in Williamston, North Carolina, very close to the coast, and then went to Campbell University, which was also the school that my mom and my dad went to. My grandparents lived right down the road. It was very still home for me. And so when I started applying to graduate schools, my mom had always pushed me to go places and see things. And so even when I was in undergraduate, I left for a summer and worked for a summer camp pretty much all over the West Coast. And then I went to New York and worked an entire summer with Stage Door Manor, assistant stage managing for them. So I went places during the summer and got used to being away and being somewhere different and experiencing somewhere different. So that certainly helped. And then it was just a leap of faith. I mean, I could have hated it. I really honestly had no idea. I moved to Boston. I didn't know anyone. My mom went up with me the first time for the graduate school, luckily held a little preview to Boston. And so they kind of helped you figure out how to find the best deals on apartments, where to look, those sorts of things. And they even kept a roommate database for you for other graduate school students, because Emerson is in the middle of the Boston Common. Graduate school students, pretty much anyone from sophomore year on to graduate school, don't get on-campus housing. It has to be off campus because it's in such a compact area in the middle of Boston. So I ended up living in Brighton between Boston College and Boston University. And I met my roommate, who was also a graduate student at Emerson, during that weekend. And we immediately looked for an apartment, and it all just happened to work out and fall into place. I was very lucky in that sense. You know, not all roommates hit it off and become friends, but we did. And it was wonderful. And I think it's all about just being open to new experiences. Things were different. Of course it was. I had to go buy a big coat because I didn't really have one. And I had to wear boots, and I had to learn to take public transportation. I mean, I lived in middle of nowhere in North Carolina. I'd had a car my entire life. Going up to Boston, I realized how expensive it was going to be to park that car, not to mention driving around places. And so I decided not to take a car. And so I lived completely on public transportation, which there is easier, but you know, taking the T, you know, sometimes it would take me an hour to get into campus because of where I lived. And so it's all just being open to experiencing something new and learning. I mean,
And the leap of faith, as you said.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's just all part of it.
Right. Well, thank you, Emily. So going back to your time as a MMJ, is there anything you believe would surprise most of the average TV consumer about TV news or broadcast in general? Something that not everyone knows about, television?
I'm kind of going to chuckle when I say this one, but I did not have a hair and makeup person. Everyone thinks that we do. I'm in a small market. Even in larger markets, they mostly don't have hair and makeup places. It's only when you get to network news, Good Morning America, Fox News, those larger NBC News, those are the places that have actual hair and makeup and clothing design people. I did not have any of that. It was trial and error. Learn to do your own makeup. I went into Sephora, just like many of you have probably done, and asked someone to help me figure out how to do my makeup and my hair and things like that. So some days you'll probably share this video in a little bit, but some days my hair is down and it looks beautiful, and other days it's up in a bun because I was rushing to breaking news and it was the best I could do. In the winter, it was hard because I'd wear a toboggan. By the way, toboggan up here is not the same thing. No, toboggan up here is a sled, but I feel comfortable enough saying toboggan to you people because you're in the South and you know what that is. So I would put on my toboggan and I'd wear it around all day because I'm out in the snow, and I'd come back and try to anchor and my hair would be so flat from wearing a hat. So I had to learn how to put in these Velcro curlers. Hilarious photos. People love to see that. And yeah, you just learn as you go, and some days I had to, I would say, please have some grace with my look today because well,
I feel like we say that every day now. Please have a little grace. And in terms of, there was no costumes, right? I mean, you were dressing to go to work to be on air. Yes.
Yeah, my laundry sometimes is really annoying because a lot of times I'd go into work in jeans and a nice shirt because I'd be out in the field and there was no telling what I was going to be doing. Going out on a toboggan, shooting an arrow, shooting a gun, going and wading through mud, or trekking 2 miles into the woods to a house fire. I had no idea. So you don't want to wear a dress to those things. So I'd come in jeans and a nice shirt, and then I'd change later for my on the desk job.
Well, we're going to look at your reel, actually, since you mentioned shooting an arrow. Let's take a look.
Everyone can try something new, even me.
So shoulder width, you grab it, bring this back to your cheek like this, and then release.
Let's see. 2 fingers.
Bring that back right to your cheekbone.
Oh, wow. Yeah, okay.
Woo! And it can get pretty competitive.
Oh
I
boy.
challenge you.
Oh boy.
And you're not part of my group. And I only get one arrow, and I have to top your score. Has anybody seen a...
Okay.
These are for testing.
Oh!
Oh, smoke them.
There's so much to do in the outdoors in Maine.
Emily Tadlock was there and joins us live now in the studio with more details. Emily?
John Morgan, 52-year-old Julio Carrillo pleaded guilty to killing his 10-year-old stepdaughter, Marissa Kennedy, in February of last year.
Such a different,
Yeah.
like we're on site and now we're out there. And my question would be is how, proportionally, were you on, on site or in the field more, or were you at the news desk or in the newsroom more?
It was honestly a mix for me, because I was also our senior reporter. After a while, I worked my way up to that. I became our senior reporter. And so when there were larger stories, we had a huge, in this reel, we had a huge murder trial. A Somerset County sheriff's officer was killed. And there was a large, 4-day manhunt for the killer. And it made national news. It was huge. And so when his trial came around, it was in Portland, which is about 2 hours south of where I'm at. But he was a sheriff's deputy in our coverage area. So I was sent down south to cover the trial. And that was much larger. And because it was a much larger story, they wanted their senior reporter on it. But then there were days where I was covering a kid's summer camp. So it was you just had to be ready for whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I liked that. The variety was really great because I won't say I love covering a murder trial, but I like the seriousness of it, of the digging down and the talking to the victims and talking to the family of the victim, really sharing their side of the story. And then I also love going to kids camps and challenging a kid to an archer duel. I mean, why not? And that was part of the fun of it. People love to see, they want to know who you are because they watch you every night. And I found very quickly that once people feel like they know you, they know you. So I would go somewhere and someone would come up and start talking to me like I'd met them 100 million times and I knew exactly who they were. And I had no idea who they were. And I just chat and chuckle and laugh. And then eventually I'd be like, so what's your name? And they would tell me, but quickly you kind of learn those things. And that's one of the reasons I liked working in a smaller market. I'm what you call a big fish in a small pond. Mm-hmm. People got to know me really well, which really helped me in terms of being able to tell stories and find stories that were unique and different, and keep us number one in our market. So.
Awesome. All right. Well, everyone, don't forget the Q&A is open. So make sure you ask those questions down below by clicking the Q&A button. So Emily, what do you miss most about your time as a MMJ?
Oh man, that's such a tough question. I'd say the storytelling. I got to meet so many people and I learned so many things. I mean, if you really feel like you're a lifelong learner and you just love to learn new things, being a journalist is the perfect job for that. Because every day you're covering something new. I mean, I learned how to use a chainsaw. I learned how to properly throw an axe, properly go down a toboggan chute. There's so many things that I got to do and so many experiences that I had, but I met awesome people and amazing people who then led me to new stories and came back to me when they had a new story. And that was all part of it, is making those contacts and making those connections and really becoming part of a community. And that is such a huge part of working as a journalist in a smaller to medium-sized market, is really delving into a community and being part of it and giving that community a voice. And I loved that. So I missed that part of it for sure.
And is there a particular story or a voice that you remember, or something that sticks out in your mind, be it in Maine or Boston or even in Raleigh when you were at as an intern here?
Yeah, so I interned at now it's Spectrum News, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Spectrum News, and then I worked as a production assistant for ABC 11. So I worked at a couple of different places and told really great stories, but oh my gosh, narrowing it down to one is so hard. I just honestly, I'll say any of the stories that I told about community, um, the good Samaritans, you know, that there are good people out there. Those are the ones that I love to tell, but also the ones that really had a strong message. A fire department here in town lost a member to suicide, and I happen to know them, and it was hard on the community, very hard on the community because no one saw it coming. And I started digging into a little more. My dad and my sister are both first responders, and so I found out that suicide is very prevalent among first responders, and I felt like something needed to be said about that. And so I did a 2-part series on responding before it's too late, ended up winning an award for it. That one was very near and dear to my heart in terms of, you know, it affected me personally, but I think it was just a strong message that people needed to hear, and there needed to be some action taken to help correct that situation.
Great. Well, thank you, Emily, for sharing that.
Yeah,
So Rich has another question for you.
sure.
Is leadership at Sargent considering broadening the podcast to be a video cast since you have such great on-air experience?
So we've talked about it. It's we're in a construction company, and a lot of them aren't super fond of being in front of the camera, but they're warming up to it a little bit. I have my ways, and yeah, no, we've talked about it, and I think for us, we wouldn't want to do it live just because we are a company. We want to make people feel comfortable coming on and speaking on our podcast. And so it would be really tough sometimes, you know, I give them a moment. If they mess up, I can say pause, and then I can edit that out, just to give them a chance to catch their breath or their thoughts. But I mean, I could even do that with a video cast. There's just some different things that I would have to do. But it's certainly been talked about, and maybe I'll do it in the future. I've done a couple of videos, especially educational ones, around benefits for employees, which is huge. I mean, learning that how much you can put into your 401k, or about our ESOP, our employee stock ownership plan. Those are all things that, especially if you're new on board, you're just learning those things. So I've done a couple of videos about that. And then we've done videos on the company. You should check out our website. It's sargent.us. And there's some different videos up there, one specifically about us being an employee stock ownership program company, and others about just the company in general. And it's really, I mean, it's our people telling their story. And so that's all part of it.
And so, with here at State, we're a STEM major school.
Mhm.
So, can you tell us? And it sounds, I mean, like you've kind of hit on a lot of it, but how important is it to be able to articulate a message or communicate in various fields that may not actually, have taught or have experience in communication, such as construction, for instance?
Yeah, it's so funny. When I was hired on, in my interview, I tell people this all the time because it always makes me chuckle, but I was asked, have you ever heard of Sargent? And when you're asked that in an interview, your impulse is to say, of course I have. Of course I've heard of Sargent, but really, have you? And as a journalist, I felt like I had to tell the truth. And so I said, no, actually I haven't. And I explained, and I said, I'm actually very surprised because I've been living here for 4 years, and I've heard of several of your competitors, and I named them out, but I've never heard of you, and you've been here longer than all of them. And the CEO immediately looked at me and said, okay, what are you going to do about that? And so that's the whole point, is they wanted more exposure. They want to be seen more, and they should be. I mean, this is such an awesome company. Wouldn't have just gone and worked anywhere.
Mhm.
They really had to rope me in to come and work here, and they did. And I'm so glad that I did. But they didn't necessarily what they needed. Social media everyone does now. Just seeing a little snippet of something later on, developers especially, we talk a lot about the landfill work that we do and the pipeline work that we do. And so to have someone, a developer, be on Facebook and see a post about such and such sergeant laid 100 feet of this pipe and did it 3 days ahead of schedule and saved us a ton of money. Those stories are important because someone's going to see it. And then later down the road, when they need that work done, they're going to go, what about that sergeant company that did such and such for such and such?
Yeah.
Social media plays such a huge part in what we do every day, what everyone does every day. And so I think construction companies are really starting to notice that we need these things. We need to be able to communicate better. The podcast was a way of initially communicating with employees, but now we communicate with employees and clients and other people who are just learning about who Sargent is. So communication is key. It really is such an important part of whatever you do.
Well, I want to come back to social media here in a second, but I do want to ask, since you brought it up, how do you, as the communications director, speak about a landfill but make it interesting to hear about? How do you do that?
So, I mean, landfills are weird in and of themselves. If you've ever been into one, sometimes they can be smelly. There's a lot of the gas coming out of the ground, there's lots of weird things, but it's all done to protect our environment and to dispose of our waste. So it sounds kind of funny to talk about it, but it really is something that's essential to where you live. If you haven't visited your local landfill, I know a lot of them actually do open house days where people can come and visit. You should go. You really should. I know it sounds silly, but really learning what these landfills do for us and for our environment, for our communities, is so important. And so being a construction company that works on them, that's easy. It's talking about what it actually does for you at home. It's not talking about necessarily the work or anything like that. Now it is showing the cool machines. I mean, we have awesome machines, excavators. We have a big, huge Cat 390 right now. If you'd asked me what that was 3 months ago, I would have laughed at you. I would have been like, oh, like a tabby cat? I don't know.
Yeah.
So, there's certain ways that you can tell a story, but really you have to be able to relate it to the viewer. That's what it's all about, is bringing it home to them. What are they going to resonate with? What's going to hit them? And so telling them, that this construction that we're doing is going to save you money, or it's going to keep you safe, or it's going to make sure that that toilet doesn't get backed up and smell later.
That's true.
Yeah.
Well, okay. All right. So going back to social media, now you were going through undergrad when social media was really starting to take hold.
Oh my gosh.
In your career, in your experience, how has social media evolved over this time? And how much do you, as communications director, utilize social media versus other means of communicating?
Oh man, it's changed so much. I took a trip down memory lane when you asked me for pictures, and I was like, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? Why are these pictures so grainy? I don't understand. Why did they look so bad? But I mean, that's just technology changing as well as social media. I think it's a way, especially during COVID times, it's a way that people can communicate from far away. I mean, here we are. I mean, I remember being back in high school or middle school and being like, oh, one day I'm going to be able to see your face when you're that far away, and now we can see that. And now I'm talking to a whole group of people that I can't even see and telling them about me. That's just crazy to think about. And social media is kind of the same way, just, with words and pictures and slight videos. Sometimes live. I mean, I used to love to do Facebook Live when I was working in journalism because it gave people a live view of what was going on and what was actually happening. So social media just really is such an important part because you never know who's going to see what, and everyone's on it. Everyone partakes. Again, we talked about mental health earlier. Taking breaks from social media is super important. There's a lot on it. And I remember working as a journalist, sometimes I would have to purposefully turn my phone off and just give myself 2 hours without being anywhere near my phone. Because it just gets like that. I mean, now I have 2 phones, and because I run our social media.
Mhm.
So there's constant communication on that. But I think finding you just, as important as that is, a phone call is also important. Face to face, even though it's hard to do in COVID times, it's still important.
Mhm.
And that podcast offered us a way to, one of the guys, when I was presenting to some of our foremen here, I asked how many of them listened to the podcast, and they actually all raised their hands, and I was slightly surprised, but not too surprised. And I asked one of the guys, why do you choose to listen? And he said, oh, well, it's like Herb Sargent, the CEO, is sitting right next to me in my truck as I drive home after work. It's like he's sitting right there with me, having a talk with me. And I
Wow.
thought that was such an important way to describe it. I mean, I use that example all the time now because it really is just like that. And that's what Herb started it for,
Mhm.
was to communicate with all of the 450 employees that we have here, even though he couldn't be in all of their trucks on the drive home.
Yeah. Well, it's so, I mean, social media allows us to be so targeted and so, like,
Yeah.
what is it that I want to hear? And I can choose what I want. My next question is, where do you see the future of communication, the future of marketing going? Do you see the trending more towards social media or going back? I mean, what are your thoughts, Emily?
Oh man, that's such a loaded question because honestly, I mean, we're already in the age of technology. Where do we go now? I mean, can our brains even comprehend that? I mean, we can barely comprehend how actually large the universe is.
Yeah.
Can we really comprehend where social media could go next? Is it going to be a live movie in your living room? I don't know. I have no idea what that looks like. I mean, streaming services have just changed over the last few months. I mean, they're playing big blockbusters in my living room now.
Yeah.
It's insane. So asking me where it's going to go, oh gosh, I have no idea. I mean, honestly, it's kind of limitless at this point. But I do hope that as COVID backs off,
Mhm.
that, we're less focused on social media and some of these things. So, maybe it'll slow down a bit. I'm not really sure it will though. I mean, we've all been so forced now
Mhm.
because of COVID. We've been so forced to do things like this, to do things virtually, to do it via computer because it's more convenient even. So I don't know that it would even go backwards at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And okay, so let's go away from the big question. Let's go to something that's a little bit more specific. Was there a class that you've taken that you found has been invaluable or you couldn't live without, but a class that wasn't specifically tied to your major? Was there a math class, a geometry class, something that like, man, I am so glad I took that?
Oh my gosh. That is a really tough question.
Okay,
Because
maybe I thought I was being a little
I
easier.
know, because it's funny. I mean, honestly, I was double majored and then I did graduate school. And so many of the classes that I took were very tailored, and I don't necessarily remember some of the other classes, but gosh. I
Or
mean,
is
I
there
can tell you
is there a skill or an experience that you've learned, be it maybe from theater or anything else that you've utilized in your, work as an anchor, work as a communications director?
how about just being a person in life? Weren't we talking about this earlier? So I remember when I first started in theater, I was acting focused and I wanted to be on stage and that's all I wanted to do. And then I was told, Emily, I think you'd make a really good stage manager. And I kind of laughed and I was like, and then I remember a certain professor pushing me to really try it. And I ended up being really good at it. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Reaves. Appreciate that. Ended up being really good at it and learning so much about organizational skills, communication skills. A stage manager has to have that because you are constantly corralling everyone. The stage manager gets no credit, none, but they are the ones who really keep the show going and keep it afloat and keep everyone in constant communication. They're the ones who always know what's going on, and they're the ones who call the cue. You're the one who communicates what's about to happen. And so, man, I can't even tell you, doing stage management made me a better person, a better communicator, more organized, all of that. So thank you, because if I hadn't done that, honestly, I wouldn't be doing what I do. I don't think if I hadn't been a stage manager.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is the how to be a person type of job, I gotta say. So thank you very much. So Ron, he just wants to ask, can you tell us really quick for everyone, what schools did you attend and what your majors were at those schools?
Okay, so I went to Campbell University first, and I was a double major in theater and communications. I actually did 5 years at Campbell because I double majored, and I tacked on an associate's degree in business while I was there. And then I moved to Boston, and I spent 2 years in graduate school at Emerson, getting my master's degree in broadcast journalism. Emerson's the #1 broadcast journalism school in the country, by the way.
Oh.
Emmy award-winning college news station. It's very impressive. I mean, if you have someone interested in doing journalism, send them to Emerson. I mean, it really is just top of the line, fantastic. Not to mention you live in Boston, so there's tons of opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I went to school.
Awesome. Okay, great. Thank you. So Amelia, you heard that. Emerson in the future, perhaps for you. Speaking of theater, have you done anything recently, or have you actually, been on stage, been behind stage, or maybe watched a show?
Okay, so I watch those all the time. I love theater. I mean, once you fall in love with theater, it's hard to fall out of love with it. So of course I go see shows. I'm actually going to see a show on Friday. They're doing Clue, and so I'm going on Friday to go see it. Local theater, Penobscot Theater Company here is phenomenal. It's professional theater and it's wonderful. So I haven't had a chance to really get involved in a ton since I was working in journalism. A lot of times it was crazy schedules, late nights, early mornings, random. I didn't know when I'd ever have time for rehearsal. So that made it very difficult. But this job is a little bit different. And I have a kid who is very interested in theater. And so been thinking about possibly helping with like an after school theater program and things like that, because I mean, theater is where I felt like I fit in and I can really be creative. And so why not give other kids a chance to do that too? And we have some wonderful, wonderful opportunities around here for kids in theater. So, while I'm not directly involved with it anymore, I'm still totally into it and I still love it.
Cool. Great. All right. Now that was a fun question. Let's ask you a more serious question before we end tonight. What has been the most important lesson you have learned during the past year with with everything that's going on, and how it relates to your work? What lessons will you take forward with you?
Let's go back to that grace. It's hard to be professional when you're on video and your cat's running in front of you, or your kids back there yelling and screaming because they're on a remote day from school, or it's really difficult. And this has not been easy for anyone, whether you've been personally touched by the pandemic, or if you really haven't felt the huge effects of it, other than being stuck at home or having to take care of your kids. No matter what, this pandemic has been different for everyone. And so with each other, yourself is super important, because while we all want to be professional and the best we can be, sometimes that's not always possible. And the best you can be sometimes is what you are in that moment. And so having grace for yourself and having grace for others who are going through the same thing. In theater, a lot of times we have to put ourselves in other people's shoes to act and to to take part in being part of a performance. And I think in life, we can all take a lesson from that in putting ourselves in someone else's shoes and just understanding their situation and having grace.
Thank you, Emily. So you may have answered this one, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it as we do with all of our guests at the end of the show. What one piece of advice would you give to a person wanting to pursue a career like yours?
Try it. Just try it. I mean, even if it's not my career, even if it's something that you're like, oh, I don't know, I'm kind of interested, try it. Don't be afraid. Just go for it. You never know what you're going to end up loving about it. I was very nervous to start this job. I mean, I loved being in journalism. So starting a job as a communications director was very nerve-wracking for me. And now I've jumped in and I do a podcast every week and I've met awesome people and I still tell stories just in a different way. And I love it. I love it. Who knows? Maybe I'll end up doing something else down the road. So just don't limit yourself, really, and challenge yourself. Always be up for a challenge. That's what I'd say.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Emily, so much for joining us. It's so great to see you after so many years.
I know.
And thank you all for joining us tonight, for listening to Emily talk a bit about her career in all the various fields. Emily, thank you so much. We'll see you again. Thanks, everyone.